Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the European Social Union debate, a podcast series from Eurovisions discussing the way ahead for the establishment of a European Social Union, with policy experts and institutional representatives. This podcast series is a spin-off of an editorial project published on the Eurovisions website, where top scholars from European universities discuss the potentialities of a European Social Union. My name is Alexander Damiano Ricci, and I'm your host. Joining today's discussion on the establishment of a European Social Union, Gabriele Bischoff, President of the Workers' Group of the European Economic and Social Committee. Also, Mrs. Bischoff is a special advisor at the German Confederation of Trade Unions, the DGB, and is now running for a seat in the European Parliament at the upcoming 2019 elections in the ranks of the German Social and Democratic Party, SPD. Welcome, Mrs. Bischoff.
Hello, very happy to be with you.
Thank you. Mrs. Bischoff, as to what concerns the social dimension of the European Union, the establishment of the European Pillar of Social Rights in Gothenburg in November 2017 can be somehow considered as a milestone. However, a number of scholars writing on Eurovisions argue that it is necessary to move ahead towards a more ambitious and comprehensive form of integration, so to speak, in the field of social Europe. They put to the fore the concept of a European Social Union. Do you agree with such a bold statement?
I mean, we have always seen the proposal for a social pillar and the Gothenburg Declaration only as a door opener to put social Europe or a social union back on the agenda of the European Union. And if you look at the current situation in Europe and the whole setting, it is very clear that we really need to enforce the social union or the social dimension of Europe very much. I mean, if you look at income inequality and poverty in Europe, it needs to be addressed. Also, if you look at the situation that we have an economic and fiscal union working, we need to counterbalance this with a strong social policy. Because it also, with the economic and fiscal union and the measures, we intervene also in the national social policy.
Would you agree that what has been done until now is not enough?
Yes, definitely. And we always had this ambiguity on what would be our concept, how to address it. But I think it has still to be developed. What is our concept for a social union? I agree that something much more bold, also much more coherent has to be developed, and it really also has to be linked to the economic policy, for example. I think this is also why the social pillar was presented. It is very clear that Europe would not have the support if it just continues with this really social wound that was also created with the crisis policies in the European Union, and that we need a bold and very strong answer to this. And if this is labeled with the concept of the European Social Union, I think this is an interesting way how to proceed. Also, when I reading the papers, I see there's still some work to do to shape this.
Right. And you mentioned the papers, so let's go and dig a bit into these contents we have on the Eurovisions website. And one of the contributions to this debate is authored by Berkan Tillon, who is Professor of Social Policy and Director of the Herman Delek Center for Social Policy at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And she concedes that we need indeed to start from the EPSR to build up this European Social Union. However, she writes as well that the failures of previous rights-based approaches should make us pause for thought. And she argues that, for instance, the struggle over the European Social Charter back in the 80s was mainly about principles and symbols, and the mountain labored only to bring forth a mouse, I'm citing here. Given your long-term experience in this field of social policies, would you agree that with this interpretation of the Social Charter of the 80s in the first place, and what makes the EPSR so different, if it is different, and what must be done to deliver these longed-for expectations on social Europe, in your opinion?
I will start with the question about the European Social Charter. And yes, I remember there were much bigger expectations connected to it. But it started off a debate, and in the end, also later on, we had this process on the Convention and on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the very essential chapter on solidarity there. But I think we really have to make sure that we will not end in a process just of principles. And therefore, the agenda that you have legal proposals connected and to the implementation of the pillar, like we had the work-life balance package, like we had the transparent working conditions, like the European Labour Agency. We really have to make sure that also this agenda will continue after the election and with the new Commission. And here we think that one of the first projects, but not the only one, would be one on a minimum income scheme in Europe. We also need other proposals concerning that we need more social investment and especially the creation of quality jobs with decent wages, and also to strengthen again collective bargaining. But one of the core projects also in our view should be a European framework directive on minimum income. In the committee as the workers group, we worked a lot for this. We already have an opinion in support of such a scheme. It is a couple of years already that we agreed on this, also with some objections of employers. And now we are discussing already on what legal basis this could be introduced and to find an agreement on that.
All right. Can you give it a bit more details about this EU framework directive on minimum income?
Yes. We think that the treaty gives room to present such a framework directive where we encourage the member states, taking into account the different systems we have in the member states, to establish minimum income schemes in their countries. Because what we realize is if we don't address these issues with the growing and persisting social inequalities in Europe, we also have very strong pull and push factors that threaten the acceptance of free movement, and therefore this would also be an important measure to stabilize the acceptance of a fair European labor market and also of a fair concept for free movement.
All right, fair enough. And this is actually really close to what Cantillon as well says in the debate. She is putting it so much in the front of the discussion in the sense that she's basically saying that is really top priority over even other kind of policies like employment policies. Would you kind of agree with such a prioritization actually of this kind of policy vis-a-vis other policies?
If we have the next period of the Commission, you cannot start just with one initiative. This will be one of the priorities. But I have to say, at the same time, we really need an initiative on minimum wages in Europe. We, as the workers' group, support very much the approach of the European trade union movement and many other stakeholders to say we need also, at the same time, have to assure that the wages in Europe are above the poverty level. This is why we support an initiative that could be taken on in the European semester to have as a benchmark the 60% of the median wages. And this would label it, on one hand, to support people and to fight poverty on member state level, but also to make sure that we don't have a persistent and growing number of working poor, and to make sure that we have more upward convergence in both areas, social protection and wages. And for us, this would be two legs that we have to address at the same time.
Let me just continue to draw a bit on Cantillon's insights, because she's basically saying that in such a EU framework, going back to the EU framework directive for minimum income, she argues that it would be a lever that could strengthen pan-European solidarity, because it would somehow increase the resources of the social funds, or at least theoretically it could go hand in hand. And she says then, however, that any such scheme, however modest in its initial ambitions, would require enhanced budgetary contributions from wealthier member states to support somehow the poor member states in Eastern and Southern Europe. I mean, I'm really oversimplifying here, but inevitably it raises somehow the question of pan-European solidarity. And given that you are running for the next European parliamentary elections, I have to ask you, would your party support such pan-European schemes?
Yes, we also would support a European unemployment scheme, which would be a very important aspect of this kind of transnational solidarity. But I think in the case of minimum income and your question concerning the social fund, the reality is at the moment with the negotiation on the new 7-year budget that we have to face severe reductions in the social funds, and that this is absolutely not acceptable, because if you really want to approach to have more social convergence, you also need to invest much more in terms of the European budget here. And in our view, the member states that have not such a minimum income scheme, they would need some support by the funds, especially for some innovative and new policies and solutions. But they would also need some more room for maneuver regarding their national budgets. Because most of the countries that don't have such a scheme already are with a very, very tight budget, and there you need a coherent solution here. But it will not be the case that you will finance permanently social benefits in another country. That would not be the case, but what you do is to help them to install such a system, because this will take a lot of resources, and to make sure then that they will be able to start and run such a system. At the same time, the idea of a European unemployment scheme means that if one country is at a crisis, it would get a special support to do employment policies and have benefits, but it would not be permanently. It would be a solidaric fund to help out countries in a special crisis situation, and with this, the people living in the country, but it would not be a permanent replacement. And it would also mean that maybe this time 1 or 2 countries need support, and in a couple of years, a country that gave support will need some support. And this is the whole idea of solidarity.
Right. Let me, however, I need to play a bit the devil's advocate here, because, I mean, you know better than me, of course, I guess, that the last general elections in Germany in 2017, a staunch Europeanist such as Martin Schulz was actually campaigning on these concepts and on a more social Europe somehow. And I mean, his score was not impressive. So I really honestly would like to have your opinion on how much you think you can score with these arguments in your country.
I think you can score a lot, because the problem that Martin Schulz had were different. He had a lot of support because he had this European approach, and you could see that the Social Democratic Party was very popular, and also a lot of new members wanted to be part of this movement of this party. But what he didn't do after the first initial claims was to come up with concrete proposals how to do it. And I think this is something that we will do different now, that we have concrete concepts like the Minimum Income Framework Directive, like, for example, a proposal for a European unemployment scheme, or like the proposal for a minimum wage policy, as I described it, in the next years. And I think there is not a lack of solidarity around, but you have to make people understand that also people and workers in Germany will not have a good life in the future if everyone around them lives under miserable conditions and is not well off. And this is something that people can understand. And in a connected economy like in the European Union, especially in a country where a lot of sectors are very export-oriented, it is well understood after the crisis we had that we need different measures to help countries out, and that the answer cannot be austerity policy. Because one lesson learned is also that austerity doesn't work, it doesn't deliver the results, that we need different tools